It's just 3 chapters today, so there's no excuses. Hello, I'm Kendall Bryan Hunter. I'm author of the book Consider My Servant Job, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point, where I always show up, I always come prepared, we never take roll, and it's bring your own refreshments. Fruit chews today. So, 3 chapters today in the book of 1 Kings, and we cover the life of Elijah. So, we're really familiar with Elijah from talk about temple work, and I really recommend the church manuals, Joseph Smith and Joseph Fielding Smith, where Joseph Smith talks about the doctrine of the spirit of Elijah and sealing power and temple work. But we're going to talk about the life of the man in the Old Testament this time, and 3 chapters is for today. So it's helpful to review his life in the Bible dictionary, and in the church thing they have links that were so easy where you just tap and you go there, and pay attention to the people. It's Elijah, Ahab, Obadiah, and Elisha, and also Jezebel. So it begins with Elijah just comes out of nowhere, and he shows up to the king and says, hey, it's time for you to repent, kind of like Abinadi. And this is the parallels. You're going to see parallels between Elijah with Abinadi, Elijah with Nephi, the son of Helaman, in the book of Helaman. There's going to be some fun parallels between those things. And it helps round out the picture of what a prophet's supposed to be doing. So that there's going to be a drought until he says so. He delivers the message to the king, and he gets out of there really quickly because, kings don't take kindly to that. They kill prophets. So there's a drought, and that parallels Helaman chapter 11, where Nephi, son of Helaman, causes a drought among the Nephites. Elijah does the same thing. And it's interesting because both have the sealing power. Although, pay attention, there's a distinction between holding the sealing power and holding the keys. Elijah held the sealing power, but he also held keys of the sealing power, whereas apparently Helaman didn't hold the keys to it. And that's the same thing with temple sealers. They hold the sealing power, but they don't have keys, and that rests with the prophet of the church. So, another parallel is with John the Baptist, where he is calling repentance to the king, and also they have an issue in 3 Nephi chapter 6 where the kings were killing prophets. So there's a strict. It's the same old what goes on in the Old Testament. It happens in the Book of Mormon. It's the same problem where people run afoul. And also keep in mind there wasn't a Bill of Rights in the Old Testament, and so things function differently. In fact, this is part of the reason why we have the Bill of Rights in the United States of America. This is what happens. The kings killed prophets. Think of a chessboard. On a chessboard, you have the pawns, you have the rooks, the knights, the king. All makes sense, but you have a bishop. Because that's one of the things that was debated in the Middle Ages: who controls the bishops? Does the king appoint the bishop, or does the pope appoint the bishop? And when it comes around July 4th, just think about the things as you're reviewing the Constitution, Declaration of Independence. So Elijah delivers the message. He runs into the desert where he gets fed by the ravens in the brook, and as Elder Holland suggests, that probably wasn't a whole lot of food, what a ravens could bring. Then he gets directed to go to the widow of Zarephath. And you have the situation where he asked to be fed first. So is this male patriarchy oppressing stuff, or was this a covenant of sacrifice? Because you look at what happens as the widow obeyed Elijah. She is blessed and had prosperity in her house, and she just never ran out of food. And then you have later on is with her son dies, and Elijah brings him back to life. The same thing that happened to Elisha in the book of 2 Kings 4, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. So he remains in hiding, as Abinadi did, and he comes out of hiding, and he meets Obadiah, who is one of the courtiers, or he worked in the court. And Obadiah was friendly to the prophets. In fact, he hid a bunch of them in a cave to keep them from being killed by Ahab and Jezebel. And this raises the question of civil disobedience. When is it a proper, when it is not proper? Post-manifesto sealings, or those an instance of civil disobedience? We're the freedom fighters, you guys are the domestic terrorists. Who gets to call who what? That's an interesting question. There's really no solid answer on when it is and when it isn't appropriate to be civilly disobedient. But we have this tradition in the Old Testament of hiding Jews, the equivalent of it. So Elijah goes to Obadiah and says, okay, tell him that I'm coming back. And Obadiah doesn't say, I don't want to do this because I'm going to get killed. And Elijah says, yeah, just tell him. And Obadiah is kind of weird that what will happen is he'll tell the king that what God will take Elijah away in a whirlwind, kind of which happened in in the book of Helaman, chapter 10, where sometimes God transports people in whirlwinds just appears that pulls them out of there. And he said, okay, I do this, you disappear, I get stuck. And just Elijah says, just go ahead and do it. So they do it. You have the second confrontation with King Ahab. And Ahab says, oh, you're the guy that troubled Israel. Sounds just like King Noah to Abinadi. It sounds just like Laman and Lemuel to Nephi. Laman and Lemuel said, we've had much trial because of Nephi. When did Nephi ever tie up Laman and Lemuel or beat them with a rod or leave them desert? He never did that, and that's what you're dealing with these narcissistic people. Everyone else, they're the victims, and everyone else the perpetrator, and it's the same thing with the kings. So they have the famous test where they build the altar, and so you have the priest of Baal, they build their altar and pray to God, and nothing happens. And it's interesting is that they start cutting themselves, which is a form of self-harm. That was part of their worship, and that's one of the things what Elijah was doing is like, hey, this is not the correct form of worship. Cutting yourself, bleeding yourself with lances, it's not how you worship God. So the prophets do it all day, nothing happens. In fact, Elijah taunts them, saying, okay, your God's asleep. But then also Elijah, sorry, the names are so this becomes a tongue twister at times. Elijah says, how long will you halt between two opinions? That reminds us of Joshua. And in the notes below, I have this, I have the quote from Brigham Young saying how it's a hell intolerable to follow the devil on one side and try and follow God on the other side. And Doctrine and Covenants, section 49, where you have the revelation to the Shakers, which is interesting. A prophet can get revelation for members of another church. That so they want to know the truth in part. It's the cafeteria Christian problem that President Nelson has talked about. People have a testimony, but they're not converted. They know you should show up to church, but they duck after sacrament meeting, or they just show up to church, sit in the foyer, take the sacrament, then go home. And it's like, that's not how church is supposed to work. Elder Maxwell talked about that twice in October 1974, and I think later in October 1992, where he gave two talks related to the same thing, where people are showing up just kind of sitting on the porch, sitting in the foyer, maybe sitting in sacrament meeting, but that's not all of discipleship. I mean, you need to go to the temple. And Elijah just raises the same question to the people. You're going back, if you're worshiping Baal, to assimilate and play friendly with the people, but on the other hand, you're trying to still be a good member of the church. Marion G. Romney called that trying to serve God without offending the devil. So that's a little bit of a digress. So you have Elijah sets up his altar, and it's 12 stones. The interesting thing is that Elijah pours water on it. So he makes this a scientifically verifiable test. He dumped a bunch of water. There's no way drenched with water that this thing could spontaneously combust. And fire comes down of heaven, consumes the water, and then they have them slay the prophets. And again, no Bill of Rights back then. You say, well, we have the Bill of Rights in plurality here because we allow people space to have their own religions. That wasn't how things worked back then. And some of these religions could get kind of nasty at a time where they killed infants with Moloch worship, passing through the fires of Moloch. That's the expression that you read in the Old Testament. So this is get to the point. So we're doing this. This is just kind of like a lawyer's brief. I try and get through as quickly as possible so you can get about your business, get the basic points, and do your own study and get your own revelation. Chapter 19 is you have Jezebel's vengeance, where she comes back and does not like what's going on. So Elijah goes into hiding again. And yes, you read that correctly. Elijah wanted to die. That's the life of a prophet. As you do stuff, you speak out, you get cancel culture, you go into jail, you get persecuted, people protest your house. And that happened to Elijah, one of the greatest prophets who ever lived. It's interesting, too, is remember that Elijah worked miracles. But he wasn't a written prophet like Moses. He's a miracle-working prophet and an oral prophet. So you think with Abinadi is that Abinadi never wrote down his message. Alma, the elder, had to write it down. The same thing with Jesus. Or this is just a cultural example. So don't misinterpret this example as with Muhammad. Muhammad, the Quran was meant to be spoken, to be recited and heard orally. Jesus Christ never wrote down his things. It was written by other people. And even Joseph Smith worked with scribes. And as a different type of, this actually goes back with a Hebrew tradition. Like I said, Abinadi is a really good historically it works within the Hebrew tradition. If you're Jewish, you understand what's going on with Elijah because he's just so much like a ancient prophet. So Elijah wanted to die, and you have angelic support. The angel guides him, provides him with food, and then Elijah goes down to Horeb. And you think about which is Mount Sinai, where Moses got the Ten Commandments. And you understand this is how a prophet develops. I mean, here he has just worked all these miracles, but even then he still needed to be taught things and learn things. So he goes to Mount Sinai, where Moses got the Ten Commandments and got the law of Moses, the Torah, and he gets instructed again about the still small voice. And that contrasts with the worldly ruckus. You study scriptures on your phone, but you're constantly getting updates. And here's this message, here's this tweet. Oh, you have to go to this, that, the other thing. You have to get yourself in an environment where it's quiet and peaceful. Shut the door. Pray in your closet, as Jesus Christ talked about. And then also the Lord spoke during the thing. Elijah was feeling alone, isolated, marginalized. But the Lord said, hey, there's 7,000 people who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And Moses, not Moses, but Paul references, sorry, I'm just confusing the names here. Paul references this in the book of Romans. And I'll have all this stuff in the notes below, so I do this on YouTube, so you can double check stuff and verify things I'm talking about, and also refresh your memory. So you have that. The next step is that I just did it again. Elijah meets Elisha, and they're getting ready to do the transition. So this isn't a sudden, drastic transition, but it's an orderly. And that's where our reading selection ends. Just 3 points, and I'm at 11 and a half minutes, but this is get to the point. So here's the Christ quotient part. Is one about, it deals with political intervention. Let's see if I have it handy. I'm sorry, I don't have it handy. In the Family Proclamation is the talks about being politically active, and it raises the question, in the United States, we have the First Amendment Establishment Clause, that churches, you can't have a state church. On the other hand, churches have a voice, and they can file amicus briefs with the Supreme Court saying, hey, this is our religious perspective on it. We certainly can lobby, but we also have the right to petition government as certainly as members of a church, and also the church institutionally. It's a right we have here. And so sort of one of these balancing questions, that we're not trying to force people to get baptized or be endowed, but we do have a voice on certain moral issues. And that's one of the issues that brings up, we don't kill, because we get the two extremes where you have a theocratic state, but on the other hand, where you have a secular state, which amounts to a religious test, which is also unconstitutional, where saying this, we're going to be completely atheistic, and that's not a correct understanding of the U.S. Constitution. So that's one, is making sure that we're being politically active and that we're voting, staying away from extremism. The other thing is what it's like to be a prophet, where you have the miracles, you have the trials, oppression, dealing with resistance. Also about the divine placement of people with Obadiah, how Obadiah hid people like Oscar Schindler, where the Lord, above and beyond that, the Lord had 7,000 people ready to who had not worshipped Baal and were ready to assist Elijah. And also with the placement of Elijah, when does God intervene? When does God send ravens? Is God sending you an angel? What does it mean just because God sends you a raven doesn't mean the angels aren't watching you? Pay attention. That's all part of the prophetic life, which we all should be living anyways. And the last thing is about the sealing power. And again, that's as you read the history, you just don't think about the sealing power, but it's probably one of the most potent powers that we have in the church, is binding of families. And it's interesting because you just don't get this as you read the life of Elijah about what does this have to do with temple marriage and families. But that's another thing you're learning about your mission call. Elijah didn't set up temple work and didn't set up a family history center during his lifetime. That actually came in a later dispensation, our dispensation, when that came to fruition, and that's something to think about. The book of Revelations talk about how our works are held in reserve. So if you die, a case of like you have a couple who has a child who dies in infancy, and they're sealed in the temple, they'll be able to continue raising that child in the afterlife. And things just are not limited to one dispensation or one lifetime, but that Christ's work is a grand work, and we all need to be part of it. And that is the point.